Hello, my sexy listeners. It's that podcast girl Cdub, and this is a podcast about house music. Or is it? I've spent years talking about house music, but not just because I like it, because I believe it changed culture. I've dedicated episodes to Larry Levan, to Paradise Garage, Jersey, Chicago, and Detroit, to the people who built something that was never just about the music. They built community. They built belonging. They built rooms where, for a few hours, people could put down whatever they'd been carrying that week and just move. I don't think I realized it at the time, but I wasn't just studying a genre. I was studying relief. Why does a repetitive beat do that to us? Why can one bass line quiet a mind that's been racing all day? Why does a dance floor feel like therapy for people who've never even met? I kept asking the historical question, but I never once asked the personal one. Why do I keep coming back? Then something happened that on paper shouldn't have mattered that much. I'm sitting in a Zoom meeting with the camera on, hosting this meeting with 14 faces staring back at me. My son is in another window of his life entirely. He's away at college, buying tickets to see Tame Impala with his friends. This would be his fourth time seeing them, actually, though I wouldn't understand what that meant until much later. I'd mentioned once, months earlier in passing, that if Tame Impala ever came back through Florida, I'd love to see them. I said it in the way you say things you don't expect anyone to remember, but my son never forgets. So he didn't just buy his tickets, he added one more for me. He just thought Mom would want to be here too. What I didn't know yet, what he and his friends already knew 4 shows deep, is that this wasn't just a concert to them. It's a full-body experience. The kind that doesn't just play at you, it moves through you, and it changes something in you a little more each time. I thought I was tagging along to my son's favorite band for a fun night. I had no idea I was about to find out exactly what he already knew. So it's funny how life works. Sometimes it doesn't change through some grand event. Sometimes it changes because someone remembered something you'd forgotten saying and decided to build a night around it. When I walked into that arena in Tampa, I wasn't looking for a meeting. I was a mother standing in a sea of 20-somethings next to my son and his besties, feeling every one of my years and none of them at the same time. If you'd asked me what I expected, I would have talked about the lights and the lasers, maybe losing my voice singing something I half knew. Just normal concert stuff, right? Instead, I left asking questions I still haven't fully answered, and that's what we're here to unpack today. So here's the part that surprised me. I've been chasing a feeling for most of my adult life. I just didn't know that's what I was doing. House music gave me that feeling first. The first few minutes on any dance floor are always the same. You're still aware of yourself and who's watching, whether you're standing right, whether you belong in the room at all. Then the beat keeps going. It doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't require you to understand it. It just repeats again, again, and again. And somewhere in that repetition, the internal noise gets quieter. The meeting from that morning disappears. The person who said something that stung you is forgotten. You're still you. You've just stopped carrying yourself for a while. For years, I thought that was the whole magic of music, that it helps us disappear into something collective. Then I stood in that arena, surrounded by my son's besties, and Tame Impala started. Kevin walked out, strummed his guitar, and started talking to us like we were the only people in the room. The bass hit differently than anything I'd felt on a dance floor before. House music's low end is really steady, 4 on the floor, looping, and hypnotic. The kind of bass that repeats until your body just falls into it and stops asking questions. That's the whole gift of it. You dissolve into the loop. Tame Impala's bass doesn't loop like that. Kevin builds it and shifts it without warning, holds a note of tension longer than feels comfortable, then releases it somewhere you didn't expect. And because it never just repeats, your body can't fully surrender to it the way it can with house. It keeps asking something of you instead. So I stood there and did something I don't usually admit to doing in public. with my hands over my chest, right at the center, then right over my belly button, letting that low end physically move through me. Not metaphorically, but physically. I could feel it moving through my actual middle in a way I've genuinely never felt from a subwoofer at a house set. Not even a great one. Not even in my own car, where I've got the bass turned to 10. This wasn't just loud. It was a frequency doing something to my nervous system in real time, and I wanted to be inside that on purpose, not just standing near it. I wanted to remember exactly what that felt. That's when I finally understood what my son and his friends already knew 4 shows in. This wasn't a concert you watched. It was one you felt in your body and carried out with you. I closed my eyes and songs started pulling up memories from rooms I hadn't visited in years. Feelings I'd filed away came back without asking permission. And standing there next to the person who thought to bring me, one sentence landed in my head, not because I was building a podcast episode, but because I was trying to understand myself in real time, in public, next to my kid. House music taught me how to lose myself, and Tame Impala taught me why I wanted to. I've turned that sentence over ever since, on the flight home, since I landed, since I hooked my new record player up to the Bose just to spin the exclusive concert vinyl I'd carried in my bag the whole way, Tampa to Orlando, Orlando to New York. House music didn't fail me, and Tame Impala didn't replace it. It isn't a comparison, it's a relationship. 2 genres answering 2 very different questions I'd been carrying around, both at once for 20 years without realizing they were even related. House music gives me permission to stop thinking about myself. Tame Impala made me curious about myself again, and that's why they belong together. So once I understood that synergy, I couldn't stop thinking about everything this podcast has actually been about. Because if you've listened from the beginning, you've probably noticed something. I don't just like music. I like asking why certain music matters. Why one song becomes the soundtrack to somebody's 20s. Why one club becomes sacred. Why a bassline from 40 years ago can still move a room full of strangers exactly the same way today. I always thought I was documenting music. I wasn't. I was documenting people and the emotions music brought up in them. Music just happened to be the lens I used to see them clearly. When I started this podcast, I thought I was telling the history of house music. Looking back, I think I was telling the history of longing. Longing for connection, for community, for somewhere that felt like home, and with people who felt like family. That's why Paradise Garage was never just a nightclub, and why Larry Levan was never just a DJ. That's why Jersey mattered, why Chicago is still on the map as the birthplace of house. None of those stories were really about records. They were about what the records made possible, about who we became because those rooms existed. Then Kevin Parker entered the chat, not trying to become part of that story. He doesn't come from house music, right? And he's not trying to recreate it. He's doing something else entirely. But somehow he ended up answering the same question I'd been asking all along. So I went looking for that feeling and where it was actually built from, not just from the songs, but the man himself. The more of Kevin's own interviews that I sat with, the more it made sense why standing in that crowd felt like something more than a concert. So in interviews, he's talked about being an anxious kid long before any of this fame happened, using the act of writing a song as a way to survive whatever mood he was stuck in that day. Not performance, but coping. His childhood wasn't steady. He said in his own words that he didn't have a solid family life or a solid base to fall back on, that he was mostly figuring things out on his own. He's talked about being around 15 and brushing his teeth and just bursting out crying because he felt so completely alone. The kid who spent hours building entire worlds out of Legos grew into a teenager who assumed nobody would ever want him in a band. So he built his own world instead, alone out of sound. And that's still how he works. A lot of people hear the name Tame Impala and picture a group. There is a real band when he performs live, friends he's grown up with, but the records themselves are him alone in a room. He's called it having a party by himself. He's described the process as a deep, dark well he climbs into and doesn't fully surface from until the record's finished. Even now, arenas full of people singing his words back to him. He said being around other musicians only reminds him how solitary his own process really is. And here's the part that hits me in the bones. He said that with every album, he's peeled back one more layer of protection, like an onion. His earliest lyrics were nothing more than nonsensical metaphors, a way of saying something without really saying it. But somewhere along the way, he found what he's described as the fulfillment of actually exposing himself in the words. And he's kept choosing that method, record after record, even though he's admitted it still scares him every time. He'll leave the first or second take of his own voice on the final record, and you can hear it if you know to listen for it. The raw, unfixed version of himself, left in on purpose. Even success didn't quiet that anxiety inside of him. When Currents made him genuinely famous, he said he couldn't think about new Tame Impala music for a long period of time afterward. The pressure got too heavy. So he hid inside DJ sets and other people's records instead, because those didn't carry that same emotional weight. That's the blueprint. A kid who built solitary worlds because he didn't think he'd be let into anyone else's. And then a grown man who still builds every record alone in a room and still every time decides to hand you the rawest parts of it anyway. So when I stood in that crowd and felt like the music was reaching inside of me directly, it wasn't chemistry or coincidence. He builds his music to be found. That's what surprised me the most. It wasn't that I suddenly became obsessed with Tame Impala, though, let's be honest, I am now. It was that standing in that crowd, I finally understood my relationship with house music. One artist didn't replace the other. One experience simply explained the other. I've replayed that night in Tampa more times than I can count. Not just the songs, but the feeling. And the quiet realization that I'd spent 20 years getting very good at using music to leave myself without ever once asking what I might find if I stayed. The people who helped me stay that night were my son and a handful of his besties, who made room for me in an arena full of people their age without a second thought. There's something Kevin Parker does that I haven't been able to shake. He doesn't perform like someone trying to convince you that they're extraordinary. He wears vintage tees on stage. I found out online that a lot of them come from a small vintage shop in LA called Cultura LA, the kind of place that sells one-of-one pieces, not merch. He'll just ruffle his own hair before a photo instead of posing for one. He's not trying to be perfect. If anything, he nearly disappears behind the music. And he's not asking for your attention, he's making space for your attention to turn inward. Most performers say, "Look at me." He somehow says, "Stay with yourself, I'm just here." I'd never experienced this before. I'm not sure I'd experienced it much at all before that night. A lot of concerts leave you impressed with the production, but this one left me curious. Curious about memory, about nostalgia, about why certain songs unlock parts of ourselves we didn't even know we'd packed away, and about why it took standing next to my son to finally open that box. Maybe this is why I've loved music in the first place all along. Not because it entertains us, not just that, and not because it distracts us, but because every once in a while, if you're lucky, it explains something about yourself that you couldn't have explained on your own. History tells us where music came from, but nights like that one tell us where we've been. So the season is going to be a little different. Yes, we'll keep talking about Kevin Parker and Tame Impala. We'll talk about his recording process and the production, the obsessive layer-by-layer way he builds a song, right in his bedroom with all of his tools and equipment around him. We'll talk about Perth, an inner speaker, lonerism, currents, and everything that made Tame Impala what it is. Because you know me, I like to dig all the way in once I find something I love. But beyond that, the season is about what happens after someone presses play. What happens when music stops being something you consume and starts becoming something you carry. What happens when a concert follows you home and keeps following you months later into another city, another show, chasing the same feeling and knowing you'll leave it a little different each time. It's strange to sit with how small the hinge was if my son hadn't remembered my offhand sentence, if he hadn't decided one more ticket was worth it on Mama's credit card, if he hadn't texted me mid-meeting and then just decided for me because I was on Do Not Disturb. He handed me the whole thing like a gift I didn't know I needed. That's the part I kept coming back to before recording this podcast episode. Sometimes it's the moments that change us. They rarely announce themselves. They're almost always disguised as an ordinary day, an ordinary meeting, an ordinary credit card charge, an ordinary text that just says, "Mom, you in?" Suddenly they aren't ordinary at all. So this is a story about what Tame Impala helped me notice, standing in that arena in Tampa with some of my favorite people in the world. I'm talking about you, Katie, Sam, Adam, and Christian, feeling both entirely out of place and exactly where I was supposed to be. The season is about music, about memory, about 20 years of chasing the same feeling without ever asking where it was leading me. Maybe all this time talking about house music, especially this past year with you, weren't leading me away from this moment. It was leading me straight into it. Because I don't think house music and Tame Impala are opposites. I think they're two chapters of the same story. One taught me how to let go, and the other is teaching me what was waiting for me when I did. And I have a feeling we're just getting started. So until next time, let's keep the beats alive.